Pretoria and Pretoria.
Colleagues, can we start? Good afternoon. Dear colleagues, your presence is always appreciated. Let's welcome the collective leadership of the NPA, led by Advocate Shaun Abrahams, who is the National Director of Public Prosecution. On his left is Dr. Silas Ramaite, SC, who is the Deputy National Director and Head of Administration in the Office of the Witness Protection. Advocate Bongile Mzinyasi is an Acting Deputy National Director and the Head of Prosecution Services nationally. Advocate Nongula Mukata is the Head of Asset Forfeiture Unit and the Deputy National Director. Colleague, this is an announcement, as I indicated to some of you, that we won't be taking questions after the announcement. We have alluded to the fact that there is already papers that have been filed, and the National Director.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and members of the media. This matter has a long, litigious, and unending history, which has been highly publicized in the print, electronic, radio, and television media since investigations into the arms deal commenced close on 2 decades ago. This matter has hence been the subject of much public interest and debate amongst many. Mr. Zuma's matter has passed through the hands of all national directors, acting national directors, and deputy national directors of public prosecutions in one way or another since the investigation into Mr. Zuma's alleged unlawful conduct first commenced by the National Prosecuting Authority's defunct Directorate of Special Operations. I would thus like to take the opportunity today to inform the nation of my decision in relation to representations I received from former President Zuma on 31 January 2018 in terms of the provisions of Section 179, subsection 2 of the Constitution to reconsider the decision to indict him on 16 charges of an 18-charge indictment. Mr. Zuma, if you would recall well, was indicted on 28 December 2007 on the following charges: 1 count of racketeering, 2 counts of corruption, 1 count of money laundering, and 12 counts of fraud. On 10 February 2009, Mr. Zuma's lawyers submitted written representations to former Acting National Director of Public Prosecutions, Mokotedi Mshe SC. On 6 April 2009, Mshe SC announced his decision to terminate the prosecution of Mr. Zuma. The very next day, on 7 April 2009, the National Prosecuting Authority withdrew the charges against Mr. Zuma in the Durban High Court. Mshe SC's decision of 6 April 2009 was taken on review. On 13 October 2017, the Supreme Court of Appeal declared Mshe SC's decision to terminate the prosecution of Mr. Zuma as irrational. The indictment served on Mr. Zuma in December 2007 thus stood. Mr. Zuma submitted representations to me in respect of the self-same indictment. After the judgment of the Supreme Court of Appeal, I appointed a vastly experienced prosecuting team to peruse the evidence and advise me on Mr. Zuma's representations. The team comprises advocates Moiponi Noko, the Director of Public Prosecutions of KwaZulu-Natal, Lungi Mshlati SC, the Director of Public Prosecutions of the Eastern Cape, Billy Downer SC, a Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions in the Western Cape, Raymond Matenjwa, a Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions in the Office of the Priority Crimes Litigation Unit, and Alnisha Kutsia, a Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions and Regional Head of the Specialized Commercial Crime Unit in the Free State. I would like to thank the team for their input and recommendations which I received on 23 February 2018 and which I considered, along with the evidential material, representations, and accompanying documentation. Mindful of the extraordinary long history of this matter, I always remain committed to bringing this matter to finality soonest. In fact, my spokesperson had on numerous occasions publicly recorded that I would like to announce my decision before the end of February 2018. However, this was not to be due to a commitment I made to an NGO to provide them with a 2 weeks notice of my readiness to announce my decision. That period, or notice period, lapsed yesterday. Earlier today, I notified Mr. Zuma in writing through his lawyers of my decision. Mr. Zuma's representations, broadly speaking, largely relate to allegations of a prosecution characterized by prosecutorial manipulation, impropriety, fair trial abuses, prosecutorial misconduct, deliberate leaking of information to the media, and irrational decisions made by various national directors and or acting national directors of public prosecutions, along with inexplicable delays for approximately 15 years in bringing his matter to trial. Mr. Zuma, in addition, disputes all the allegations against him and records that he lacked the requisite intention to commit any of the crimes listed in the indictment. These allegations, Mr. Zuma firmly places at the door of the National Prosecuting Authority some former national directors of public prosecutions, acting national directors, some in the leadership of the NPA, and some prosecutors and investigators. In this regard, justice must not only be done, but must also be seen to be done. I am mindful that everyone is equal before the law and enjoy the rights to equal protection and benefit of the law. Similarly, the National Prosecuting Authority, in executing its constitutional and legal mandate, will ensure that alleged perpetrators of crime will be prosecuted without fear, favor, or prejudice, irrespective of their station in life. On the facts of this matter, and in the interests of transparency, the interests of the administration of justice, and in the interests of the National Prosecuting Authority, I am of the view that a trial court would be the most appropriate forum for these issues to be ventilated and to be decided upon. After consideration of the matter, I am of the view that there are reasonable prospects of a successful prosecution of Mr. Zuma on the charges listed in the indictment, served on Mr. Zuma prior to the termination of the matter by Mshe SC. As a result, Mr. Zuma's representations are unsuccessful. The Director of Public Prosecutions, KwaZulu-Natal, will facilitate the necessary processes for Mr. Zuma and his co-accused to appear in court. Lastly, an application for the permanent stay of the prosecution of Mr. Zuma has recently been filed in the Cape High Court by an NGO. I, along with the National Prosecuting Authority, have been cited as respondents in this matter. I have instructed the State Attorney to brief Senior Counsel to oppose this application. Members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, this then concludes today's announcement. Thank you for coming.
At the end of the matter, please thank you for coming.
Breaking news there, live visuals straight from the NPA headquarters out in Pretoria. As we've just heard, Mr. Abrahams there announcing on the decision whether or not to prosecute former President Jacob Zuma. He started by reminding us that President Zuma was indicted back in 2007 for the 17 charges, and Zuma's lawyers then followed that up in 2009 with representations to Mche, who subsequently dropped the charges following these. While news just in, Abrahams said he's always remained committed to bringing this matter to finality, hence wanting to make an announcement last month, saying today that he did notify Mr. Zuma of his decision through his lawyers. That is, he will be prosecuted. Let me hand you over to Peter Ndoro, who's sitting by with Aldrin Sempier, to also get their views on this announcement. Guys, it's over to you.
Alicia, thanks very much indeed. Gentlemen, I guess not a surprise. I mean, everything was pointing towards this. There's been a change in government, and perhaps this man was vulnerable, but also the court processes up until this point had been exhausted. And his last chance was his representations in January, and they were not successful. Your immediate reaction to the statement that was made, Makosini?
Look, I think this may very well be a good, decision to have been taken by Advocate Shaun Abrahams, but I really do not think that he had any choice. There was just no legal avenue for him to take any other decision. And he will take credit, of course, because he made the announcement, he took the decision and he made the announcement, but I don't think that he had any choice, really. I think legally everything was pointing to a decision being taken, even public interest, just public interest. There is an expectation out there on the side of the people, the general public, that all of us must be equal before the law, that if he has a case to answer, and nobody has ever said that the case is weak. The case was always, there was always a prima facie case. There may have been different views at one point or the other, but there was always a prosecutable case. And I think that it is a victory for constitutionalism, it is a victory for the rule of law in the country, and that all of us are equal before the law.
Aldrin, he gave us a hint of what was in those representations that President Zuma made. How different are those ones to the ones that he's made before? It sounds very much the same.
It certainly does sound the same. And even earlier when Makosini was speaking about that suspicion that they had during your time in the NPA, and President Jacob Zuma, well then former Deputy President Jacob Zuma, accusing the NPA of leaking information to the media and vice versa. And this time around he's making the same allegations and saying that there has been these prosecutors who've been leaking this information to the media. Also spoke about impropriety from the prosecutorial side, and blaming, absolutely seems that everyone, including their former NDPPs, including the former acting NDPPs. But quite interesting, I just quickly want to go back to the 2007, 2009 representation that he made at the time. One of his contentions, which is quite interesting, is that he said there's a risk of political, economic and social instability should the NPA proceed with his prosecution. This was back in 2009. And one then wonders that what could have changed now. Is that because at the time you were anticipating that you would be president, and now that you are not president, probably you feel that there couldn't be any political instability. Another issue that he raised at the time was President Zuma had this contention that the delays in finalizing the prosecution and the trial would undermine his right to a fair trial. That's exactly what he said just now as well.
Yeah.
All right. So does that suggest that they couldn't find actual law to back up their representations?
You know, I think this is now me speaking
Yeah.
as a public relations
Right.
strategist.
Right.
You know, when you have a matter in court and you also have to worry about the court of public opinion, usually you have the legal strategy being supported by the public relations strategy. But President Zuma does it the other way. He has a political strategy to deal with the charges. And the legal strategy just supports the political strategy. What is the political strategy? Play the victim, stretch this thing, the Stalingrad defense, that you question each and everything that is placed in front of you. And at the same time, you're galvanizing political support for yourself. So what is going to happen now is that as this NGO has filed an application for the permanent stay of prosecution, there's going to be that process. You put the charges here, he questions something. So he kicks the can right down the road up to a point where, if you do find a conviction, it will be 10 years from now. At that time, he's 85 years old, and not many people would want to see an old man in orange overalls. So his is a political a strategy that is supported by a legal strategy. And you can see what is happening in KZN. The matter is going to be heard in KZN, and that's why he's more active politically. Most ANC presidents, when their time is done, they retreat from the ANC and become statesmen, as it were. That's what Nelson Mandela did to a very large extent. President Mbeki did the same. But President Zuma is involved in ANC structures, particularly in KZN, particularly in eThekwini, which is where the matter is going to be held. So that whenever he appears there, there's going to be some political support. There are going to be some people who are going to be saying, no, he's being prosecuted. You can expect that President Ramaphosa will be insulted and things like that. So in the end, there may very well be other people who may see this as an opportunity for them to start some sort of disquiet, so that in the end to force the National Prosecuting Authority or the country to say, maybe we don't need to proceed.
Legally, what happens from Monday? I mean, there will be, his lawyers will start to find ways to try and stymie the process. But in theory, what happens from Monday? And what is a possible timeline should all these legal games are dealt with timeously?
I think what is going to happen either way, he will have to present himself in court, to be formally arraigned. And then from there, his lawyers will have to make a call as to how they proceed with the matter, whether it's a permanent stay of prosecution application or dismissal of charges or anything like that. But appearing in court, he will appear at the Durban High Court as things appear, because he'll have to answer to the charges. He'll have to go and present himself in court. That's usually the procedure.
Does he get arrested at all?
No. No. He wouldn't be arrested. He wouldn't. I think he's just going to present himself in court. They will tell him when he must appear in court, and he'll just present himself in court. You place somebody under arrest and put them in handcuffs, either to stop them from committing a crime, or you want to make sure that they present themselves in court, or you feel that they are a flood risk, or they may do something that is undesirable. But in the case of a former head of state, someone who is protected by the state, there is that question doesn't arise. There will be anybody who has a desire of seeing him in handcuffs. They may disabuse themselves of that. It's not going to happen.
Uncharted water, Peter. It is uncharted water.
Right. And we will talk about what happens when he gets to trial. But the process that took us here, Shaun Abrahams talks about convening this team and them deciding and giving him a recommendation. Is that something that would have happened during your day when Vusipugole had to make the decision? So is this not an unusual process?
It's not very unusual. I mean, the prosecuting team has to have the biggest say, because they were in court, they prosecuted the matter when the national director was sitting in his office in Pretoria. And the alleged crimes were committed in KZN, so the director of public prosecutions for that jurisdiction will have to be involved, and the people who were members of the original prosecuting team, they will have to be involved. Of course, they would have to make recommendations to the national director, but the final decision is taken by the national director as to whether he prosecutes or not, given the magnitude and the public profile of the person involved and the matter itself, and how much it has gone through the hands of every NDPP that we've ever been, whether permanent or acting. So he had to take that decision, and he's taken that decision, and he announced it today.
All right, so perhaps we can clear up something as well. I was under the impression it was 18 charges, and he talked about representations being made on 16.
16 charges. Yeah.
Is it 16 charges? Is it 18? Or he only dealt with 16 charges?
I think what could have happened, and I speak under correction here, is that after the representation was made, because remember that after the Supreme Court of Appeal upheld the High Court ruling, that meant that the 18 charges that were in the indictment that was served back in 2007 does remain. But after the representation was made and they looked at some of the charges, looked at some of the evidence, and probably looked at some of the witnesses that were available, I understand that the NPA, there was some report that all 213 witnesses that were listed at the time, all of them were available. That probably the prosecutorial team felt that actually not all 18 charges, let's rather go for the 16 charges, and the 2 other charges fall away. And I just tweeted now, because we're not allowed to ask questions at the press briefing, we wouldn't know what the reasoning is behind that decision to let the 2 other charges fall away.
Yeah. But usually prosecutors want to take to court a case that they are confident they can win. If when they look at the charges and they review and they see that there are prospects that he can be acquitted on this charge, or it's not strong enough, they would usually drop it. So that's not unusual. But I think President Zuma has a mountain to climb. Because remember that Schabir Shaik has already been convicted. Yeah. And I don't think they are buddies. I think their bromance is over now.
Do you think that Schabir Shaik would come in as a
well,
witness?
he did say that he was willing to, he was going to testify. He was quoted at some point.
He could be subpoenaed anyway.
He could be subpoenaed anyway, even if he's a hostile witness. I mean, he could be subpoenaed, but I think if you look at his own trials and tribulations, he can't be too happy with President Zuma at this time. And President Zuma is no longer president of the Republic, and therefore, you know, his fair game to many people.
I was trying to read between the lines here, and there's representations. They said he lacked the requisite intention. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but it sounds as if he's saying, I took the money, but I didn't know what the money was for.
You know, I think from the beginning, in the relationship that former President Zuma had with Schabir Shaik, it was always going to be about, he is my financial advisor, okay? I'm financially illiterate. This is the man who's responsible for my finances. I don't know what he does. What I know is that my money goes into my bank account and he's responsible for everything. What he does, I don't know. I think that was always going to be his defense. But also, I think, you know, given some of the things that are going to be spoken about, you know, I think there is a possibility. For instance, with the fax, you remember that there was a fax where it was supposed to be confirmation of a bribe, etc. That, you know, it's plausible that he can say he didn't know what was happening. Whatever signals he may have made, it meant something else and not what Schabir Shaik had said. But I think insofar as the totality and the, you know, the whole picture, the big picture, I think he's got a mountain to climb in defending himself against these charges. They are just, I think, just too strong and too overwhelming.
You know, the strange thing is that I actually thought that in his representation, because this was indicated in the statement from the presidency after the Supreme Court of Appeal ruling, that, that the president may be, quote unquote, interested in the Johan van der Walt matter. Yes. Because Johan van der Walt is the auditor who compiled the report into the Shabir
KPMG,
from
yes.
KPMG, who compiled the report that led to Shabir Sheikh's conviction as well. But remember that many years later, and this is now last year, KPMG withdrew a report that was compiled by Johan van der Walt, and that report related to the SARS rogue unit. And the question was then, will President Jacob Zuma, when he makes representation, say that you can't rely on this man's evidence, he's been discredited already.
But you see, this is now where I think that is not very, I think it's disingenuous a defense, because at the end of the day, the court is the final arbiter of what is acceptable evidence and what is not acceptable evidence. Johan van der Walt's evidence got Shabir Sheikh convicted. He appealed.
All the way.
All the way,
Yeah.
you know, until he had
Understood.
no choice but to go serve time in prison. So, you know, I may have my own suspicions that if a Metro cop pulls me on the side of the road and gives me a ticket, I may have my own, you know, suspicions as to why he's picking on me. But if I've done something wrong, I've done something wrong.
So at the height of it all, it was about the timing of the prosecution, and we got a hint, and we were chatting about it just now. And I just wonder, is that something that still carries on, where you actually have to sit and say, we must time this prosecution just right? This happened in the US recently. Hillary Clinton was running for office, FBI, I think it was, decided to release information that she was still not off the hook. And some people say she lost the election as a result of that.
The emails,
So it's
yeah.
crossing into politics. Does the NPA have to sometimes think about when to prosecute or when to issue an indictment? Or is it, listen, we'll do it tomorrow and that's it?
Look, I think I would be disingenuous if I said that public interest is completely ignored. That wouldn't be the truth. I don't think that to sit and say, okay, we've taken a decision to prosecute, but when do we make this announcement? If you make the announcement before the conference, then you might be seen to be trying to influence the conference. If you charge him after the conference, it could be that now, because your political master Thabo Mbeki has lost, now you are using the state institution to do what you know would stop this man becoming president of the country. So those decisions are always problematic. But in this particular instance, right now, it really doesn't arise anymore. He has been president. He's not president anymore. He was kicked out of office by his own political party for issues that are not related to this matter. Now his citizen, Jacob Zuma, he can be charged at any time. I don't think that the timing of the charges has any bearing on the political environment or any you know, conversations that people might be having.
All right, so we're going to continue with this conversation shortly, but what we'd like to do is start moving around the country a little bit and get a sense of reaction to the decision by the Director of Public Prosecutions, Shaun Abrahams. They're going after former President Jacob Zuma. Alicia, where are we going?
Well, Peter, we are going to Port Elizabeth, where we do understand our reporter Zolan Moya is standing by with the NC's national spokesperson, Mr. Pulemabe, to get the NC's reaction on that decision to prosecute the former president. Zolan, it's over to you.
A very good afternoon to you. Yes, we are indeed crossing live here at Florence Matomal House in Port Elizabeth, where the NPA has pronounced that they will indeed prosecute President Jacob Zuma. With me here, I have the spokesperson of the African National Congress, Mr. Pulemabe. Mr. Mabe, the ANC has obviously taken a firm decision to prosecute former President Jacob Zuma. What is your reaction?
Well, we must state up front, we've already issued a statement where we have communicated a message of the ANC, which has been conveyed by the Secretary General of the movement, Comrade Ace Magashule, where we are making a point that the former president of the ANC and the Republic of South Africa, President Zuma, is of course presumed innocent until proven otherwise, and that the National Prosecuting Authority must be given space to do its work. He also must be accorded the same space to be able to attend to the issues that have been brought forward. And I am sure that we have got a constitution in this country that protects the right of all. So former President Jacob Zuma's rights are equally protected by the same constitution.
So in a nutshell, you're saying to me that, to be specific, the African National Congress has welcomed this particular decision that has been taken by the NPA?
Well, we do welcome this. We're just emphasizing that, like all other individuals, when charged, you remain innocent until proven otherwise. So we really we welcome the decision, and we will be watching the developments quite closely.
Obviously, during the national conference in December, President Ramaphosa pronounced that ANC will do anything on its best to fight corruption on every street corner. Can that be the direction that the ANC is taking from now on going forward?
Well, you will know that the issues that are being labored on would have been labored on even before Ramaphosa was president of the ANC. So it is rather unfair, because this has got nothing to do with the stance taken by the ANC at its 54th National Conference. Safe to say that the position of the movement as it relates to what we've already articulated on, whether it's the stand we're taking on how our leadership must be projecting themselves and all of that, acting in a responsible manner, and all of those things. These are things that we have already said. But it is fair that when a big decision such as this is being made, individuals are also accorded space to exercise their right as given to them by the Constitution of the Republic.
Obviously, inside here at Florence Matomela a few minutes ago, I spotted Fikile Mbalola, Aaron Motsoaledi, the SGAs, Mahashule, and other provincial leaders. Tell me, what is the why are you guys here? What is the primary reason for that?
Well, we visit all our structures in the country. You will know that there are issues here in Nelson Mandela Bay that require the attention of all of us, whether it's the PEC, whether it's at a national level, whether it's at the regional executive committee level. You'll also know that there's an issue, the looming motion of no confidence that one of the opposition parties here has been talking about. Of course, the ANC has got a responsibility to engage with its own deployees at this level of government, so that it can understand what are the issues and all of that, but to be also ready its own machinery in an event it needs to take certain decisions to try and make sure that it salvages the leadership of the Metro.
Just to be more specific, just to put you on the spot, who is your candidate when Mayor Athol Trobe gets removed on the 29th?
You will accept that the ANC has got its own internal processes. And it is those internal processes of the ANC which will effectively determine who becomes the candidate of the ANC if such an opportunity makes itself available to assume the seat of government here in the Metro.
But to be specific, who gives the mandate? Because I'm sure members of the ANC, ordinary members that normally vote for the ANC, did not give you a mandate, to be the man. Obviously, during the local government election, you were rejected.
That's why we are coming and engaging with our structures, because the ANC has always believed that its ability to govern and lead at whatever level is further pronounced and made possible by the confidence expressed by the people.
What is the ANC going to do differently after the 29th?
Well, the ANC is already doing quite a lot of things differently. One of them is to make sure that you see, every time, if there is an organization that is able to humble itself, we've done it in Gauteng, we've done it in Johannesburg, we've done it in Tshwane, we're doing it here in Nelson Mandela Bay to try and come and understand what are the challenges, what are the issues that we did not pay much attention on, what is it that the people of the Metro would expect of us to be doing going forward, so that we can continue working together with them to make sure that we change their living conditions. You will see, you will know that there are problems of electricity here, there are problems of waste removals here and all of that. All of these things are caused by the absence of the ANC in governance.
That was the national spokesperson of the African National Congress, Mr. Pulemabo, telling us that the ANC will do anything on its power to make sure that they win back the confidence of those that have voted for them, and that they do accept indeed the stern decision that has been taken by the National Prosecuting Authority. Well, that is what I have here for now in Port Elizabeth. Back to you in Auckland Park.
Thank you so much to Zolani Moye there. He was joined by ANC National Spokesperson Mustapule Mabe, who says they welcome the decision, saying that when an accused is accused, they are supposed to be innocent until perceived otherwise. All right, let's get more reaction now with Patricia Vesache, who's standing by at the NPA headquarters. Patricia, what do you have for us now? The decision has been taken. Former President Jacob Zuma will be prosecuted on 16 charges.
Well, good afternoon, Alicia, and to our viewers. Now, of course, after that announcement by the NPA, it simply means that finally, after so many years, President Jacob Zuma, or rather former President Jacob Zuma, will finally have his day in court, where he will have to answer for those corruption charges that have been long standing, way before he was even head of state of the country. So without wasting any time, let's turn our attention to the NPA spokesperson, Advocate Luvuyo Mfako. Now the attention turns to KZN. Unpack the team that has, of course, been appointed to lead this prosecution.
The team is led by the DPP KZN Advocate Moiponi Noko. Remember, in terms of jurisdiction, the matter falls within that area. He's assisted by Advocate Lungi Mahlati SC, Billy Downer SC, Raymond Matenjwa, who is a deputy, as well as Alicia Kutsia, who is the regional head of SCCU in Bloemfontein.
And how long before we actually see this matter playing out in court? Is there a particular time frame that we should expect?
Remember, the matter was withdrawn, and therefore it's a question of reinstating, re-enrolling it. So what will happen is the DPP KZN would arrange with the lawyers representing the former president and the registrar of the High Court to find a suitable date to all the parties so that the matter can be re-enrolled.
Okay. And any challenges that you are faced with at this stage as the NPA, as you are trying to, of course, deal with the nitty-gritties of preparing for this case?
At this stage, no challenges, but there's a legal challenge in the sense that there's an organization that has filed papers. We've been served sometime last week. In essence, they applying for permanent stay of prosecution. It was filed in the Western Cape, so we will have to respond to those court papers.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. As you know, the NPA has made it very clear that they will not delve into the legal merits of this matter. So we'll leave it there with the NPA spokesperson, Advocate Luvuyo Mfako. And of course, it means the country at large will be awaiting that date when it will be finally announced that President Jacob Zuma will be going up against the NPA in court, where he will be answering for his long-standing corruption charges. Now I'm joining with legal journalist Karen Mon, who will help us unpack the historic profile of this case. I mean, since 2009, it is a cloud that has been hanging not only over the head of former President Jacob Zuma, but his whole administration, the country as a whole.
Absolutely. I mean, this was the very same room in which then acting head of the NPA, Mokotedi Mshe, made that announcement in April 2009 that, in fact, he decided to drop the Zuma prosecution based, of course, on the so-called spy tape recordings, which he believed showed that there had been interference or undue interference in the prosecution at which President Jacob Zuma, who was then the ANC president, was charged with corruption following the ANC's Polokwane conference. Now, what is important is that we hear from the insights provided to us by Advocate Shaun Abrahams today that those same political sort of conspiracy theories that define the decision that Mshe made are in fact being raised again by the former president, that he believes that there were unexplained delays in his prosecution, that he believes that there was interference, that there was misconduct and poor motives defining his prosecution. And very much a hint, Patricia, that we may well see some legal action from the president, not just this NGO in Cape Town, in the wake of this decision, that he may well decide to go to a court of law and take it on review. And of course, Advocate Shaun Abrahams saying today, well, you can raise these points, but actually raise them in a court of law, raise them in your trial, and let the court decide whether or not they are serious enough to warrant you being found not guilty of corruption.
And on that point, that's perhaps one of the major reasons why he was not taking questions from the media, saying that the matter is sub judice and it will be improper for him to have back and forths with the media.
Well, his decision is definitely going to be challenged in court. I mean, I think there is a very distinct possibility that the former president may well bring a review application. We know from letters that he sent to the National Prosecuting Authority that he was very unhappy about the racketeering charge under the Prevention of Organised Crime Act that's been brought against him. It's an immensely serious charge. It carries a 25-year prison sentence. So he will take legal action to challenge that. We also know that he said in documents, his lawyers sent to the NPA, that he would intend to bring a permanent stay of prosecution. So we're looking at 3 separate legal challenges, all of which will ultimately be funded by taxpayers. And as we've heard in Parliament this week, of course, President Cyril Ramaphosa revealing that the spy tapes litigation, which was the fight over the decision not to prosecute on its own, has already cost South Africans 15.3 million rand.
Now, in terms of the noise that we have over the years observed from the public domain, especially from the political arena, this is perhaps good news for them. Especially for the DA. We've heard them this week saying that they will accept nothing but a decision to prosecute the former president. From that angle, what are we looking at?
I think one of the most important things that Advocate Abrahams said when he gave this address was about this principle of equality before the law. And remember when Deputy Judge President Aubrey Ledwaba gave the spy tapes ruling in the North Gauteng High Court, he questioned whether Mokotedi Mshe could understand what kind of impression this would leave for ordinary South Africans, that someone who's seen as politically powerful is not subjected to the same kind of level of questioning that a normal person would be. And Advocate Shaun Abrahams again saying that the principle of equality of the law before the law demanded that former President Zuma should answer these questions. And I think the Constitution has won here today, the South African public has won here today, and the most important thing is that finally, after years and years and years of speculation, the president's former financial advisor being convicted of corrupting him, those 783 charges, paying for his children's school fees, paying for car washes, paying rentals for him, he finally gets the opportunity to come into a court of law and answer to that and provide what he says we now know to the NPA is an innocent explanation for what has happened. But ordinary South Africans will know that if you're accused of these kind of things, you are going to have to answer those questions in a court of law. And I think that's important.
And be it as it may, I think for many of us is the fact that why did it take so long? Even for him, Advocate Shaun Abrahams, after especially the appeals court found that it was irrational to withdraw the charges in 2009, rather, why didn't he act immediately? Why did he have to succumb to all the pressure that we have seen playing out over the couple of months?
You know, Advocate Shaun Abrahams came under attack for that. And of course, we saw in the court of law, in the Kasak matter involving Mxolisi Mkasana's golden handshake, there were a lot of questions raised by Kasak about Shaun Abrahams' handling of the spy tapes matter. And of course, the court in that case found that essentially that the NPA head had taken the side of the former president in the litigation. Of course, that judgment in the SCA that you mentioned came through in October last year, where the complexion of the political dynamics of this country were very different. And of course, we know that Shaun Abrahams was writing to Zuma's lawyers. At that time, he was assembling a team to advise him. He was getting people together to track down the 218 odd witnesses that could potentially testify in this trial. But, you know, there are going to be critics who'll say, you know, Shabir Sheikh was convicted. The evidence is before. Why did it take so long? And there are going to be people who believe that maybe that decision was motivated by the fact that we now have a different president whose rhetoric is very much about anti-corruption. So I think, that Shaun Abrahams has refuted that. He said that he did everything according to the tests of the law. But there is still this perception, and I think the NPA is aware that it's going to have to deal with that going forward.
And the other question falls on the fact that he himself has been found by a court of law to be unfit to hold this position. His days are numbered as NPA boss. And here he came with this decision that some would say was perhaps unexpected, as he had nothing to lose. He's going out anyway.
Well, I mean, the court found that his appointment was invalid because the golden handshake deal that was given to Mxolisi Mkasana was in fact illegal, and that Shaun Abrahams essentially didn't go into a position that actually existed, and therefore he should be removed. And the original court said in the North Gauteng High Court said, basically, if Shaun Abrahams remains in office, it's rewarding former President Zuma for his illegal conduct in that case. And the court was very unhappy about Shaun Abrahams remaining in office. Now, his argument is actually, I haven't been found to be unfit. The court may have raised issues about, for instance, his treatment of the allegations of wrongdoing against Nonkobo Jiba. They may have found that he seemed to take the president's side in the Nkosana and spy tapes matter. But he's saying, look, it's unfair to say that I must be removed. I haven't been found guilty of any wrongdoing. But we could see in the next few days the Constitutional Court of this country turning around and saying we agree with the North Gauteng High Court, and that in fact this appointment was invalid, in which case Shaun Abrahams in the last few days of his office will have made a momentous history-changing decision for the first time in South African history, for the first time in the history of democratic South Africa, a National Director of Public Prosecutions making a decision to charge a former head of state for corruption. And I mean, that will be his mark in history. So whether it was about him showing people that he isn't the puppet that he's been made out to be, or about him leaving a legacy that he was the person who made this decision, I think that will be, key questions that we'll all be unpacking in years to come.
And something interesting that he mentioned while he made the announcement, or just before he made the final announcement, was that this matter has gone through the hands of so many NPA heads, and now a final decision has to be made. And it made me wonder, is it his decision, or was he pressurized perhaps by other, role players within the NPA to make the right decision?
I think the fact of the matter is that he's always maintained that he's independent and he operates without fear and favor. But in the light of the court rulings that have already been given in this case, the High Court ruling, the SCA ruling, those courts said he should be prosecuted. And when people make representations, as the former president did, you have to show the NPA that they don't have good prospects of success in getting a conviction in order to justify them withdrawing the case. Now, we know that Shabir Sheikh was convicted of corrupting the president. We know that, thousands upon thousands of documents were seized when his home and the homes of his and offices of his lawyers were raided all those years ago. We know that there's the encrypted fax, which speaks to this alleged bribe that he received from an arms company, Tint, in order to protect it from potential action linked to arms deal investigations. We know that there is a weight of evidence. We know that when Shabir Sheikh was convicted, for example, the state showed that there were 5 instances in which Zuma had apparently acted in Sheikh's interests, used his official position as former tourism MEC and then subsequently deputy president to act in Sheikh's interests. At the time that the NPA was preparing to prosecute him all those years later, they had 28 such instances. So given the weight of the evidence, given that, Shabir Sheikh had been convicted, there was really very little room to maneuver. And, all these claims of conspiracy that Zuma has made, I think Abrahams is right. I think they must be tested and ventilated in a court of law, because the NPA can't be seen as the body that shuts that case down. The South African public would never have accepted that.
And that's very true, but one cannot deny the fact that the same NPA has been doing that for years. And again, they stood by while the integrity and the credibility of the NPA was diluted. And some would say all of that to protect one man.
I think that's a very valid criticism. And I mean, when one considers Vusi Pikoli, when he was removed from office, when he challenged that removal, he actually said that he had been removed because he would have stood up and said Zuma should be prosecuted. And they wanted a more pliable National Director of Public Prosecutions to come into office. We know Mxolisi Mkasana went on affidavit and said that, former President Jacob Zuma was terrified of being prosecuted and that he believed his removal was based on the fact that Zuma believed that he intended to prosecute him in the wake of the spy tapes ruling. So, there has been this since the decision to withdraw the case in 2009 in this room, the NPA has struggled with this perception that it doesn't act without fear and favor, and that people who take on the president or show some degree of independence are then targeted and removed. And this, hopefully not just only prosecuting the president, but this will hopefully be a new era for the NPA where it proves that's not right.
All right. Thank you so much there, legal journalist Karen Moon, just unpacking the historic profile of this particular case. Now, you would know that it means there's only one way for this matter, long litigation awaiting, a battle between the former president, Jacob Zuma, and the NPA. That, of course, is looming. And as she rightfully said, that it would be the first time in this country's history that a former head of state would be taken on in a court battle for such serious charges. But for now, we can just wait and see how exactly the process unfolds as the attention falls on KZN for now. But it's back to you in studio.
Thank you so much to our reporter there, Patricia Versace, joining us live from the NPA headquarters out in Pretoria. For more analysis on that NPA decision, let's welcome via Skype now our constitutional law expert, Professor Pierre de Vos. Prof, a very good afternoon to you. Your reaction to the decision to prosecute the former president?
Well, it wasn't actually a decision to prosecute him. It was a decision not to drop the charges, because the Supreme Court of Appeal had already made it clear that there was a valid decision to charge the president. So this was just a question of, should the charges be dropped again? And the NPA said, in line with the SAA judgment, that no, they are not going to drop the charges because there is a winnable case.
Look, Prof, does the former president have any legal framework to appeal this decision? Because we did hear Mr. Abrahams making it very adamant in his decision. They're saying that he has instructed his team not to give an appeal to the former president.
Well, I don't think there's an appeal to this decision in the sense that the decision is now made. Theoretically, the president could challenge the decision not to drop the charges, but that will never hold water in a court of law. His next option is to approach the court and to ask the court to have a permanent stay of prosecution, so that the court decides whether he is capable of getting a fair trial. And that could be done, of course. That is what was, so that is a possibility.
All right, and Prof, I want to get your views on why do you think finally they decided on 16 and not the 18 charges to be brought against the former president?
That I don't know. I wasn't part of the team that made the decision. Usually when this happens and one has to give the benefit of the doubt to the NPA, it is usually because they feel they cannot secure conviction on those other charges. So I would assume this is the same issue, the same principle here.
All right. And Prof, just another one. Do you think today's decision by Mr. Shaun Abrahams, do you think it will go far in restoring the public trust in the entity that is the NPA?
Well, the decision, of course, the NPA was severely criticized also by the Supreme Court of Appeal in the judgment, the so-called spy tapes judgment. In that judgment, they made it very clear that the NPA really had no other choice but to continue with the prosecution. Whether this now restores the credibility, I think maybe it's a little bit early to say. We will have to wait and see.
All right. And Prof, what do you think about this when it comes to the rumored political influence, whether back then in terms of Mr. Mshe and in this case, looking at how everything is unfolding with Mr. Ramaphosa and even, of course, Mr. Abrahams?
Well, what the Supreme Court of Appeal has said is that, there might well be from time to time considerations taken into account that are political, and that's not a good idea. But if there's a winnable case, and if the decision was taken to actually secure a conviction, that is what matters. And that is, so you can't just drop charges because there might have been some problem with one person, might have had some other ulterior purpose. If the aim was always to secure a conviction, unless the person cannot get a fair trial, the trial must continue.
All right, and Prof, before I let you go, just one more thing that I need clarity on. I mean, we've heard this phrase that back then the wrong law was actually used to drop the charges back then. Talk to us about that. Do you think everything was considered now coming into this decision?
Well, in the past, of course, when the charges were originally dropped by Mr. Mshe, he invoked provisions that were inappropriate. In this particular case, there was no dropping of the charges. The court had already ruled that there must be a prosecution, so the original decision had revived, so to speak, from the dead. So there was no reason to invoke a section to drop charges, because that is not the decision that was actually taken.
Professor, thank you so much for your sound analysis there. Thank you so much. That is Professor Pierre de Vos joining us via phone and Skype, and also giving us analysis on that decision by Mr. Shaun Abrahams a while ago to prosecute or bring those charges against the former President Jacob Zuma. I hand you now back to Peter, who's still sitting with Mr. Aldrin Sampear and Mr. Nkosi, deliberating on this very same issue. And maybe just to start there with you, Peter, I want to ask Mr. Makosini there, that instruction that was granted by Mr. Abrahams to his team not to grant the decision to appeal for Zuma's team. What do you think about that?
Sorry, I'm not sure if I got the question.
Say the question again.
Well, basically, Mr. Abrahams did mention there, he says he instructed his team to not grant Zuma's team or leave to appeal the decision of course, to reinstate those charges today.
Yes, I think that is informed by the decision that the NPA has a strong case against the former president. But also in his representations, there's nothing that's persuading them. And the decision that he has taken is that let the trial court deal with all Mr. Zuma's grievances. But he has a case to answer, and they think that it's a winnable case. There are good prospects that he could be found guilty. And if he has any issues and he's got any grievances that he needs to raise, he'll have to use the court processes. And of course, I think knowing how he's been doing things, he will litigate right up to maybe even the Constitutional Court litigating against the charges.
All right. We have to start wrapping up, but I think one big issue that needs to be resolved in the coming weeks, and this is sitting on the desk of the now president, he was deputy when the instruction came from the Constitutional Court, is what to do with Shaun Abrahams and what the implications are in terms of all these decisions that he's made up until this point. So perhaps you start, because you've been following that story for a while.
Sure. Yeah, it was the High Court that took the decision and said that that the appointment of Shaun Abrahams was irregular and illegal and must be set aside, and that Mxolisi Nxasane did not in actual fact resign in accordance to the specifications that he should have resigned by. But it said also that both these candidates cannot be considered for the position, which technically meant that after, I think they were giving them a reprieve about 60 days, that after about 60 days there must be a vacancy declared in the office of the NDPP. But of course, this issue has now gone to the Constitutional Court, and the Council for the Advancement of South Africa's Constitution, CASAC, has taken this matter to the Constitutional Court to seek confirmation on this ruling, that this ruling must be upheld, and that's where the matter is at the moment. So we're waiting for the Constitutional Court to hand down a ruling and say whether it upholds this this ruling by the High Court. Should Shaun Abrahams step aside should Mxolisi Nxasana be reinstated, what happens now. But either way, whatever happens to Shaun Abrahams, even if the court says that his appointment was irregular, we should consider what happened to Menzi Simelane, the former NDPP. Remember, after his appointment, it was again the DA that challenged his appointment and took this matter all the way to the Constitutional Court based on the findings of the Frini Jinwala Commission. The commission which found that he misled the commission and that he's not a man of integrity, which is one of the conditions that you need to become an NDPP, besides just being an advocate. And when the court set aside his appointment, the Constitutional Court set aside its appointment, it said in order to avoid a constitutional crisis, what we will do is that we say that his appointment is irregular, but whatever decisions he had taken before still remain valid. And that's the same thing, whatever the outcome is, and if the court found that Shaun Abrahams' appointment must be set aside, I anticipate that the court will say that whatever decisions he had taken before must remain valid. So you can just consider how many cases have been before him and how many cases he has ruled on, and those cases have been prosecuted and some of those people have been found guilty already.
Right. And then perhaps for you as a final question, and I'm asking you to look into the future. A lot of people are already probably getting their subscriptions to television sorted so they can see this trial. But it's not going to happen for a number of years. And then even at the end of that, can we possibly see a former head of state in jail? I can't see it somehow.
Look, I think taking into account the fact that President Zuma is very litigious, he litigates, okay? I think he is going to file an application for a stay of prosecution, and it may go right up to the Constitutional Court. After that, maybe that could be 2 or 3 years, I do not know. After that, maybe if we start the trial, you know, even if he's found guilty, we can be assured that he would appeal, take it to the Supreme Court of Appeal, sometimes maybe perhaps even to the Constitutional Court, so that after the whole process, it may be 10 years down the line, at that time maybe he would be around 85, 86, too old by other people's standards to go to prison. But I think if you're talking about the appetite that the public has, it is to see him being held to account. Is to see him going to court, facing these charges, and I think that's what speaks to equality before the law. If you ask me as a political commentator if we'll ever see him in orange overalls, I would say it's unlikely.
All right, and that's where we're going to leave it. Aldrin Sampear and Makosini Nkosi, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and thank you very much both for your insights.
Thank you.
Welcome.
All right, so this story, I'm sure, is going to continue to unfold in the coming days. We'll continue right now with our coverage, but we take a break first. We'll be back after this.
Nations, 44 matches live on SABC 1 and 19 SABC radio stations. SABC is the official broadcaster of the 2018 FIFA World Cup Russia.
Welcome to Media Monitor, the show that analyzes the big news stories that made headlines. We bring you robust discussions on stories that made headlines in the week, where we interact with media analysts to unpack these top stories. Join me every Sunday morning from 9 to 10 Central African Time as I bring you riveting news and analysis.
Stay tuned to Media Monitor every Sunday from 9 a.m.
Welcome back. You're watching News Today, and we're giving you more coverage, of course, of that decision that was made a little bit earlier on by the MPP director, Shaun Abrahams, who said that they are going to prosecute the former president, Jacob Zuma, and that he will be facing the law in the coming years. I'm sure it's not going to happen overnight, and we've been getting a reaction and thoughts from analysts, but we're now joined by MP Themba Godi. Thank you very much indeed, and welcome to the program. Your reaction to what's been a very long process to get us to this decision process. Some people will say, you know, this is 13 years too late.
Well, I think two things stand out. Firstly, it is the length of time that this matter has been on the public space. And secondly, it's a very momentous aspect, the fact that a former head of state is being charged. But because it has been on the public space for so long, you somehow want some level of closure or finality around the matter. And I think today's decision is opening the door for us as a country to find closure on the matter in terms of saying, well, there have been allegations in the public space. Can they go to court? Can they be tested there? So that we can finally know what went wrong, who was wrong, what was wrong. But I must say that from where I'm seated, I think this was the most likely outcome because Advocate NPA stopped the prosecution purely on the basis of abuse of process. And the High Court has found that using abuse of process as a basis is rational. And the former president also agreed, which means all we're left with now was the substance of the charges. Are they substantive or not? And from what Advocate Abrahams indicated, it's like the representations by the former president were also largely based once again on abuse of process, meaning in all likelihood, we're going to come up with the decision that we're having.
What is your feeling about the National Prosecuting Authority itself now? Do you think that this perhaps might be starting to rebuild trust with the public, that they are going now after these cases? We've seen some arrests related to the Guptas recently, and now this prosecution against the former head of state. Is this encouraging for you?
Well, look, I've had time to engage Advocate Abrahams. Like on Wednesday, he was. Sorry. He was in Parliament before Scopa in the evening on the work of the NPA and to say, are you guys doing your work? And at all times, he has said, look, he is doing his work and he will do his work, and all he needs is for all of us to give him the space to do his work, so that the decision to prosecute the former president must not be seen as a response to the calls that were very loud out there, but it must be seen as a purely legal decision. I don't think one swallow makes a summer, if at all that was the case, because it's not as if prosecute Zuma then will take you to be a serious person. I think that will be very subjective. I do think that if you look at some of the things that have been happening, I had a sense that Shaun Abrahams does want to do the right things. And what you need, however, is to say, how do you ensure that the NPA and the Hawks, because sometimes your investigations take long, sometimes your investigations are sloppy, and you therefore can't prosecute. There is need to bring synergy between the two, so that we can, when we judge and we say, you guys don't want to prosecute, we can say, here was a watertight case, investigated by the police and handed over to you.
All right, okay, we're going to continue our conversation in a short while, but right now let's catch up and get a little bit more reaction. Alicia, you have a guest on the line.
Absolutely, Peter. I'm very pleased to welcome on the line the former NPA head, Mr. Vusi Pikoli. Sir, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I guess the first thing, I want to hear your reactions as the former NDPP. Mr. Pikoli, sir, are you on the line with us? All right, it looks like we're struggling with Mr. Pikoli there. I was assured he was definitely on the line, but I'm going to throw it back to Peter with Mr. Thembagodi to continue this while we try and get hold of that former NDPP and try to gauge his reaction as to what does he think about this reaction, of course, the decision to prosecute the former president. Peter?
Thanks very much indeed, Alicia. You know, this case, unfortunately, has had a lot of casualties over time. We've seen Vusi Pikoli and a number of other people perhaps seen as casualties of a long process. How do we start to, I don't know, mend these fences so that this kind of thing doesn't ever happen again?
Well, look, I think the man who put us in this situation is Advocate Bulelani, right at the beginning, Nguka. Because remember, he's the one who said there's a prima facie case, but I'm not prosecuting. I think that is what created the problems that we've had. But, you know, sometimes one looks at these things and say, you know, as a country, we are developing, we're moving forward. And some of the beautiful things that we have in our constitution, in our laws, will only have meaning and take shape in the course of, you know, falling and rising up and all that kind of stuff. And I think this will serve as a good lesson to all of us. And I think there will be more awareness about the need to insulate the NPA from political machinations. Because if the former president, Thabo Mbeki, had not asked or sought to ask Vusi Pikoli to sort of time his recharging of the former president based on the political calendar of the ruling party, we will not be here. So when you look back,
but
you
we
realize...
don't know that that's a fact, that he said delay this prosecution.
Well, I thought that was what was central to Vusi Pikoli's problems. That's why the Ginwala investigation found that there was nothing wrong with Vusi Pikoli. And anyway, the former president was not saying don't prosecute. He was saying the timing. And I'm saying that is interference, because you need to allow the NPA to do whatever it wants to do, independent of whatever political process are playing themselves out within the political arena, so that they can prosecute without fear, favor, or prejudice, irrespective of one's position in life, whether you are a leader or whether you're an ordinary person, so that all of us can have the confidence that if there is a case that is leveled against you, the final arbiter should be the courts, where you are given an opportunity to prove your innocence or otherwise.
You know, we watch you a lot now, and people have come to understand that there are these committees in Parliament that are holding the executive to account. And we then, because you represent us as the public, and I just wonder, could Parliament have played a bigger role in making sure that a lot of these institutions are doing their work, doing their work properly?
Well, I think in terms of its oversight work, Parliament could have, and I think it still should, you know, do better. And even ourselves as the Public Accounts Committee, I can't say we have reached the pinnacle of how to do oversight. There is still room for improvement, and there is need for improvement. That is why after our engagement with the NPA this past Wednesday evening, we actually realized that we need to have the NPA and the Hawks together in the same hearing, so as to ensure that investigation and prosecution are all looked at the same time, at the same level. And I think at some point, our oversight work as Parliament generally, we drop the ball. You see a flurry of activities right now. My only concern is that it must not be transient. It must be institutionalized, so that even after 2019 elections, we must still find the same tempo in terms of how we hold the executive to account. And I think if Parliament was at its peak level in terms of holding the executive to account, I think a lot of these matters that you know, were carrying from the past could most probably have been addressed and not have been allowed to drag on endlessly.
There's been talk, as we were discussing with analysts earlier on, that, you know, political interference somehow found its way into the NPA in one way or another, whether they either forced decisions or not, but there was almost this hand that was there. And one wonders then if, as Parliament, do you not need to be having a conversation about changing the powers of the executive to appoint an NDPP? Or do we say that there should be, you put your choice like the Americans do, and then there's a vetting process that maybe Parliament or somebody else does separately?
Well, you'll be surprised that even Afghanistan vets ministers once they're nominated by the president. I think, look, the exercise of executive power, whilst it is legal, there is a lot of political consideration that goes into it. And a lot has to do with the extent to which those who wield political power are committed to doing the right things and actually submit themselves to the laws and the Constitution. I do think that the executive and parliament, in as much as theoretically they are supposed to be equal, but in practice, I think you will agree, almost everywhere in the world, you find that those who are in the executive are those who, in the political context, are the most senior within the majority party, and that has its own impact. Even Parliament's oversight work is not a purely administrative process. It is a political. There are political considerations from time to time by various members, whether they are from the opposition or from the ruling party. But I do believe that an active citizenry is ultimately a panacea, because if our people are distanced from the processes either of government or of parliament, that allows the space for arrogance and for people to do as they please. And my experience, if you look at public accounts, the misuse of public money, is that your challenge is not legislation. Legislation is there, but do you have the political will to follow through? Even now we're in the process of amending the powers of the Auditor General so that he can, have enforcement powers. Why? Because the administrative and political leadership is just not able to follow through with the laws. So yes, Parliament has a responsibility, a bigger one, if one may say. But I think there are quite some shortcomings that you need to address.
What do you think has been our biggest failures in terms of this matter? Because it then speaks to what needs to be fixed.
I think the NPA, for me, has been the cause of the problem. From since when the decision was taken to withdraw the charges to date, I think that's where the problem has been, because ultimately that is the institution that must take the decision. Failing which, you must then take the court route. So if the NPA itself can always act in ways that even if they are taken to court, they are found to have been procedural. Firstly, that will breed trust, and secondly, it will discourage people from taking you to court, because now every decision you take, anyone with money who does not agree will say, let's go and test it in court. And once you have that kind of situation, then the integrity of your institutions is non-existent.
I'm going to ask you to put on your MP hat on right now, and I'm a citizen, and I'm sitting at home, I'm working hard, and my tax money is going to SARS, and then they give the money to the budget to the state, and I'm told today that, this case could run another 4 or 5 years, there'll be appeals, and that the taxpayer may still be footing the bill here. How do we appease citizenry when we see millions of taxpayers' rand being tied up in lengthy legal processes? Forget what's happened. There's still quite a journey ahead of us.
Look, that's a tough one. I don't think I can ever convince you that there is merit, in this in this kind of approach, because so many of our people have almost nothing or very little, and those of us in political office who have enough are still diverting resources that should go to these people on matters that are actually of our own doing. So I don't think that any MP or anyone in government can stand up and justify some of these things, which are a result, you know, of very low political morality, where our sense of duty to our people is just not there, where servant leadership is absent, and it's almost like people can do as they please. So I think, like I said, this is big, and I think it does call on us to take a pause and say what needs to be done in a way that really changes the way we approach things and the trajectory of our thinking, our politicking, and even our leadership.
You said that you had the opportunity to get inside the mind a little bit of Shaun Abrahams, and that he wants to do the right thing. Do you think that President Ramaphosa should give him a chance to carry on?
Look, when I say the NPA must be given the space to do its work, I also think even those who say Shaun Abrahams must go, that should also be seen as an aspect of interference, because you are placing a value judgment and insisting that it be so. That will become a subjective judgment. Even if it's made by the judges, they are human beings. So I think, you know, for sake of stability, and because as you are aware, since Bulelani Ngoka, we haven't had anyone who has been, you know, permanent there. Even with the police, if you look since George Fivers, you have never had anyone who have served throughout. So in the absence of stability, you can't build institutions and you can't instill a culture of rules-based administration. I think that those who doubted Shaun Abrahams and his independence, I think for me, when you look at the Estina matters, when you look at this particular case and a whole range, KZN, Mabuya Kulu and others, I think he's saying, let me do my work. And to say, do your work yesterday, I see that as part of interference. Give them the space, let them do their work, and let's see what happens.
If you had the president's ear right now, what would you say to him?
Give the man a chance.
I mean, no, in fact, I say the president, I'm former president, as is what I'm thinking. If you had his ear right now, because he can appeal, he can go through this and probably will end up again where we are, what would you say to him rather now?
Well, I would say, look, comrade, they are the charges. You have always denied them, and even in our representations, you denied them. Go to court and have your day. Whatever the outcome, well, take them, you know, like a comrade, and accept your punishment if you are found guilty. If you're not found guilty, then you would have freed a lot of people from all the doubts that have been hanging there for so many years, that I doubt if we'll ever have another case that will, you know, be dragged out for so long in such a way that it actually creates fatigue, you know, in the public space or in the public debate. We need to have this thing resolved one way or the other.
Thank you so much for your time and sharing your thoughts with us today. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so that was MP Themba Godi, who you've seen working very hard with the SCOPA in making sure that government is working hard for us. Commenting on the work, on the decision that's been made today by the NPA head. Alicia, I believe you've got the former NDPP on the line.
Absolutely, Peter. Let's try once again. A very good afternoon. Let's welcome the former NPA head, Mr. Vusi Pikoli, on the line. So are you on the line this afternoon? Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
So let's get your reactions. I mean, as the former NDPP, do you think this was just a frivolous waste of time, resources, as well as money, seeing the outcome of today's decision?
Well, clearly a lot of money. Well, clearly a lot of money and resources have been spent on this matter. It has taken quite some time to be where it is, but I suppose it's also a celebration of our democracy, our constitutional democracy, as well as a victory for the rule of law.
And with that in mind, so what type of lessons do you think we as a nation could be learned from this whole saga?
Well, the issue is that trials should be brought to court as speedily as possible, and that also we must always make sure that there is no political interference in the work of the prosecutors, as well as that the heads of the various institutions of state, particularly those that are supposed to be independent, are people of high integrity, so that this can then reflect itself on the institutional integrity of the institutions they lead.
And speaking of the institution, of course, Mr. Pikoli, do you think this even redeems Mr. Shaun Abrahams, whom we know still has a cloud hanging over his head as to whether or not he might keep his job? And do you see this as a first step by the National Prosecuting Authority in redressing what has happened and them being synonymous into, of course, fueling the crime in this country?
Well, I somehow feel sorry for Mr. Abrahams, for Advocate Abrahams, because he has been put under so much pressure in trying to deal with this matter. And I think he had to follow the due process, particularly after he lost at the Supreme Court of Appeal. So he thought it wise to give Mr. Zuma an opportunity to make representations and also handed the matter over to some other prosecutors to deal with the matter. So I think we have reached a stage where now he had to take a decision on the matter, and he has taken that decision.
Mr. Pikoli, another clarity that I seek from you as well. We've heard the phrase cropping up time and time again when we speak about this issue, the phrase of political interference. You were the former NDPP, so do you feel that you were subjected to any kind of influence politically or otherwise when you dealt with this matter?
Well, not insofar as this matter relating to Mr. Zuma. There was no political interference that I experienced. The only interference I experienced at the political level was at the time when we were investigating the late former National Commissioner of Police.
Mm-hmm. All right, and Mr. Pikoli, before I let you go, just please share with us right now. A lot of people are asking what is going to be the next process. Is President Jacob Zuma, former president, going to be arrested? What is the next line of procedure that is going to follow?
Well, I suppose he will be given a date, or his lawyers will be served with a date that is expected to make an appearance in court. And the matters will be taken from there, which might mean that he might not be asked to plead on the first day. There might be a day where he will plead to the charges.
Mr. Pikoli, thank you so much for your time. So we have to leave it there. That was a reaction from the former NPA head, Mr. Vusi Pikoli, on that decision that was announced early this afternoon by NPA head, Mr. Shaun Abrahams, to bring those charges, 16 charges in total, against former President Jacob Zuma. Let's take a quick ad break and we start the bulletin in earnest in a short while.
Welcome to Media Monitor, the show that analyzes the big news stories that made headlines. We bring you robust discussions on stories that made headlines in the week, where we interact with media analysts to unpack these top stories. Join me every Sunday morning from 9 to 10 Central African Time as I bring you riveting news and analysis.
Stay tuned to Media Monitor every Sunday from 9 a.m.
Corruption both in the public and the private sectors needs to be combated.
Where there are clear cases of wrong that has been done, that must commence immediately.
Something is being done about corruption in our country.
Currency, even although it strengthened dramatically after the ANC's recent elective conference, could conceivably go stronger yet.
He had a soul that would not be for sale.
Stay tuned to Your World for your final news roundup, Monday to Sunday at 21:30.
A very good afternoon. This is now the last leg of all the top stories from all around the globe. I'm Alicia Ntlantla-Jali. It is now 5 p.m. Central African time. Peter.
Good afternoon, Alicia. Good afternoon to you. Thanks very much for tuning in wherever you may be watching across the continent. This is News Today, and these are the headlines.
Parties in Parliament have welcomed the decision by the National Prosecuting Authority to prosecute former President Jacob Zuma on charges of corruption, fraud and racketeering.
President Cyril Ramaphosa resumes his tour of the SADC region on Saturday with visits to Mozambique and Zimbabwe.
And in your sporting news, sprinter Clarence Munyai breaks South Africa's men's 200 meters record.
In our top story this hour, National Prosecuting Authority head Shaun Abrahams has announced that former President Jacob Zuma will face criminal charges. Zuma faces charges of corruption, money laundering and racketeering.
Making the announcement out in Pretoria, NPA head Mr. Shaun Abrahams reinstated 16 of the 18 charges for 700 counts of corruption, money laundering, fraud and racketeering. Last year, the Supreme Court confirmed a High Court decision that former NPA head Mokotedi Mshiya had erred when he decided to drop the corruption charges against Zuma back in 2009. And Zuma's former financial advisor Shabir Sheikh was imprisoned for 15 years for his involvement on some of those charges.
In this regard, justice must not only be done, but must also be seen to be done. I am mindful that everyone is equal before the law and enjoy the rights to equal protection and benefit of the law. Similarly, the National Prosecuting Authority, in executing its constitutional and legal mandate, will ensure that alleged perpetrators of crime will be prosecuted without fear, favor, or prejudice, irrespective of their station in life. On the facts of this matter, and in the interests of transparency, the interests of the administration of justice, and in the interests of the National Prosecuting Authority, I am of the view that a trial court would be the most appropriate forum for these issues to be ventilated and to be decided upon. After consideration of the matter, I am of the view that there are reasonable prospects of a successful prosecution of Mr. Zuma on the charges listed in the indictment served on Mr. Zuma prior to the termination of the matter by Mshe SC. As a result, Mr. Zuma's representations are unsuccessful. The Director of Public Prosecutions, KwaZulu-Natal, will facilitate the necessary processes for Mr. Zuma and his co-accused to appear in court. Lastly, an application for the permanent stay of the prosecution of Mr. Zuma has recently been filed in the Cape High Court by an NGO. I, along with the National Prosecuting Authority, have been cited as respondents in this matter. I have instructed the State Attorney to brief Senior Counsel to oppose this application.
Well, parties out in Parliament have welcomed the decision by the National Prosecuting Authority to prosecute former President Jacob Zuma on charges of corruption, fraud and racketeering.
We must state up front, we've already issued a statement where we have communicated a message of the ANC, which has been conveyed by the Secretary General of the movement, Comrade Ace Magashule, where we are making a point that the former president of the ANC and the Republic of South Africa, President Zuma, is of course presumed innocent until proven otherwise, and that the National Prosecuting Authority must be given space to do its work. He also must be accorded the same space to be able to attend to the issues that have been brought forward. And I am sure that we have got a constitution in this country that protects the right of all. So former President Jacob Zuma's rights are equally protected by the same constitution.
Firstly, it is the length of time that this matter has been on the public space. And secondly, it's a very momentous aspect, the fact that a former head of state is being charged. But because it has been on the public space for so long, you somehow want some level of closure or finality around the matter. And I think today's decision is opening the door for us as a country to find closure on the matter in terms of saying, well, there have been allegations in the public space. Can they go to court? Can they be tested there? So that we can finally know what went wrong, who was wrong, what was wrong.
Also spoke earlier on to former NPA head Vusi Pikoli.
Well, clearly a lot of money and resources have been spent on this matter. It has taken quite some time to be where it is. But I suppose it's also a celebration of our democracy, our constitutional democracy, as well as a victory for the rule of law.
The situation is reported to be calm in Eshowe on the KwaZulu-Natal north coast after residents burned down a farmhouse and 3 sugarcane farms.
This happened after a security guard working on the farm allegedly shot and killed a 30-year-old man on Wednesday. Sipamandla Xulu was with his friends on their way to fish at a dam on the farm when the guards shot him.
Locals then went on the rampage and burnt the farms and the house in an apparent act of revenge. They also confiscated a truck from a motorist and used it to block the very busy R66.
President Cyril Ramaphosa will continue with his tour of the SADC region again this weekend. The visit forms part of a long-standing tradition in the SADC region whereby newly elected heads of state pay courtesy calls to their neighboring countries.
And since taking over as the President of South Africa, President Ramaphosa has embarked on a tour of some countries in the SADC region. During his visit to different member states, the president will discuss bilateral cooperation as well as issues of peace and security in the region, the continent and the globe. He will be accompanied by Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Lindiwe Sisulu, as well as State Security Minister Dipuo Tsatsi-Tuba.
Our Bill of Rights is the cornerstone of democracy. It enshrines the rights of all people in our country and affirms the democratic values of human dignity. SABC News celebrates Human Rights Month in the year of Madiba. #KnowYourRights.
Welcome to Media Monitor, the show that analyzes the big news stories that made headlines. We bring you robust discussions on stories that made headlines in the week, where we interact with media analysts to unpack these top stories. Join me every Sunday morning from 9 to 10 Central African Time as I bring you riveting news and analysis.
Stay tuned to Media Monitor every Sunday from 9 a.m.
Welcome back. The markets have just closed a short while ago, and we've been monitoring the situation. And just when NPA Chief Shaun Abrahams said, quote, after consideration on the matter, I'm of the view that there are reasonable prospects for a successful prosecution of Mr. Zuma, unquote, the rand remained steady after the announcement that former President Jacob Zuma's prosecution would move forward. The currency was at 11 rand 95 to the dollar and 16 rand 65 to the pound. €1 cost 14 rand 67. And for a market rep, the oil share has battled to find traction all week long amid concerns over import tariffs imposed by U.S. President Donald Trump. Analysts say the potential for a steel trade tariff warfare continues to cloud overall market sentiment. Trade is expected to tread carefully ahead of a long-awaited Moody's pronouncement next Friday, this time on South Africa's credit status. Moody's is the only major rating agency to have South Africa's sovereign credit rating above junk status after S&P Global Ratings and Fitch lowered it to junk in 2017. Should it downgrade South Africa any further, government bonds will fall out of a number of global bonds indices, including the City World Government Bond Index. According to analysts, pressure will sustain on the rand until next week, Friday. The investigative unit of online newspaper The Daily Maverick says tax boss Tom Moyane has contravened the VAT and Tax Acts to facilitate a 70 million rand VAT payment to Gupta-owned company Oak Bay Investments. The VAT refunds paid to a third party, Terbium Financial Services, have raised concerns of possible money laundering and fraud. According to the Tax Act, a company that's not registered with the Payment Association of South Africa cannot receive payment on behalf of another company. According to the Daily Maverick, it took only 8 days for these refunds to be finalized, whereas other companies struggled for years to do so. It says Tom Moyane contradicted himself on whether or not he was personally involved with the payments.
He wanted to make us believe that he stood aside from the process. He had nothing to do with the whole process. He just saw all the emails and all the discussions run through his inbox, and he didn't do anything about it, and he afforded Rafilwe Mokoena to make the decision. And on the second instance, Tom Moyane then says, but I actually did make a discretionary choice, and I did decide in terms of Section 72 of the VAT Act to make the payment. And those two things are totally contradictory. You can't tell us that on the one hand, you didn't do anything and you allowed other people to make the choices, and on the other hand, that you exercised discretion. Those two things don't go together.
Same time, SARS boss Tom Moyane faces a deadline to hand over 2 investigative reports into the questionable money affairs of its top official, Jonas Makwakwa. Makwakwa, who resigned from SARS on Tuesday, is alleged to have misled SARS with regards to declarations of interest in the appointment of National Integrated Credit Solutions as one of 8 debt collectors to recover debt owed to SARS. He was suspended on money laundering allegations and then controversially reinstated last year. Makwakwa faces allegations of impropriety in the selection and appointment of a credit solutions company, NICS. The report earlier pointed to corrupt activities between NCIS and Makwakwa, resulting in illegal payments of up to 400,000 rands. Media 24 has admitted to price fixing and agreed to pay about 14 million rand in a settlement agreed with the Competition Commission. Media 24 is part of 28 media companies referred to the Tribunal for Prosecution. The case relates to a November 2011 investigation which found that through the media credit coordinators, various media companies agreed to offer similar discounts and payment terms to advertising agencies that place advertisements with MCC members. In terms of the settlement agreement, Media 24 has agreed to pay an administrative penalty amounting to 13.8 million rand. It has further agreed to contribute 4.9 million rand to the Economic Development Fund over a 3-year period. The company will also provide a 25 rather 25% bonus advertising space for every rand of advertising space bought by qualifying small agencies over 3 years and capped at 35 million rand annually. Pro-Vantage Media has also admitted to price fixing and has agreed to pay 1 million rand as part of its settlement agreement. Well, that's my settlement for this week, and it has been a pleasure doing business with you on this fantastic and fabulous Friday afternoon. Well, it's up to Pearl with sports and sports with Pearl. Ciao, ciao.
A very good morning to you, and thank you so much indeed for choosing Morning Live.
But I want to know that basic thing.
Griselda Lewis, SABC News, in Parktown, Johannesburg.
Zimbabwe, Mzondeli Beje, SABC News, Luanda, Angola.
Let's take a look at your market indicators.
Thanks for staying with Morning Live. Let's bring you your sports news.
Let's take a look at your satellite image.
Set the agenda for the day with Morning Live.
Sprinter Clarence Munyai is the new men's